Our next panel discussion, which is a plenary with several speakers, will address supporting the real economy growth. It's a discussion with Laurence Boone, Chief Economist of the OECD, Éric Lombard, CEO of Caisse des Dépôts, Laurent Mignon, Chairman of BPCE, and also Chairman of the French Bank Federation, Hiroshi Nakaso, Chairman of FinCity Tokyo, and José Vinals, Chairman of Standard Chartered Bank. Let's welcome them for a discussion moderated by Emmanuel Dutain, Editor-in-Chief of Les Echos Capital Finance. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So in this session, the panelists will challenge and exchange their views on how the finance industry could, should, and actually already does support the real economic growth. So I would like to kick off this panel with the big picture. Europe, a lot has already been said about financial and capital markets, but I would like to gather your view on that. Laurent Mignon, we'll start with you. What would be your call for action for fair functioning of the capital markets?
Well, I think, thank you very much for the question, and very happy to be here with you today. I think it's, as mentioned by the introductory notes, it's a very timely moment because of the Brexit, forthcoming Brexit. I think the number one thing is really to complete the European Banking Union. We have, I think, a great success which has been done around the ECB creation and the single supervisory through the SSM, which is really have been a success, implemented in a few years and given a high credibility to that institution and also to the European banks altogether. But we have to go further and to create a true harmonized European banking landscape, which means more fluidity and ability to have a transfer of liquidity or capital throughout Europe, which means less national views around that and a true European regulation to that. Number two is, as also mentioned by the present panel, is that we have to finalize or go further in capital market union, which is a very important element to have a strong European based capital union. Number two is, I think, while doing so, we have to be careful of preserving the specificity of the European market, specifically when during the transposition of Basel III or Basel IV, whatever you call it. And it is very important. This is something that will come in the next months, and I think it's we need to pay a lot of attention to make sure that this transposition is done in a way that preserve the ability for the French banking, the European banking. Sorry, that's a bias. The European banking industry is going. And third, I think, is really working on creating an attractive and safe market for investors and issuers, while helping Europe to be to transition toward a more sustainable and economic growth. That means everything about the green taxonomy and sector, developing a green market, which is a very strong and large market already in Europe, probably the larger one today. Two is probably thinking about simplifying some rules or making a review of the calibration and relevance of some of the rules that have been implemented, I think specifically to MiFID II. And third is, last point, but I think very important, is implement safe rules in terms of competition and security for data and use, transfer, protection of data, and so that, and more generally, probably everything about cybersecurity and AML environment.
That's a busy agenda. Laurence Boone, maybe from a more macroeconomic perspective on financial/capital markets, what should be, in your view, the top priorities for Europe?
Thanks, Emmanuel, and thanks for having invited me. It's really a pleasure to be in such good company. Let me make 3 points. The first one is to remind people why it's important to have more financial integration. And I think beyond more growth, better capital allocation, more diversified risk, larger investment opportunities, it would also help promote the EU banking sector because it will give them a 27 countries playing field rather than national smaller one. It would also help monetary policy to actually be more effective. And that means that we would probably need less low or negative interest rates and less QE. So for that reasons, and given the objective for bank profitability, I think that would be super helpful. Second point is banking union, which has already been mentioned a couple of times. And to the risk of being repetitive, I think there cannot be banking integration with national ring fencing. And what really worries us is that this is very pregnant at the moment. But there cannot be a disappearance of national ring fencing if there's no fiscal backstop to the single resolution fund. In the US, you have a large credit line. We still don't have it in Europe, and there's little political appetite for that. We should also favor cross-border merger, and I think there again, policymakers' appetite has been quite small. And then continue cleansing banks' balance sheet, and in that respect, perhaps we should have allowed, and perhaps it's not too late, a transition period between the bailout regime and the BRRD regime, because since then, NPL are declining, but too slowly. Now, several speakers already mentioned capital market union, and somebody reminded that it was 40 years old project, so we would like this to be more operational rather than aspirational. And for this, I think there are a few things that could be done. The first one is to ensure that accounting standards, so IFRS norms, are actually interpreted and implemented in the same way across Europe. And for that, you probably need a European umbrella. The second is we talk about bankruptcy regime harmonization. As we know, it's super difficult. But why not create an optional European bankruptcy regime? The third is, I think, enhanced stock market participation. Again, private pension fund can complement monetized public ones. And finally, I think there's really a lot of things we can do on harmonizing guidelines, rule, regulation for financial products such as insurance products with common CSR and ESG reporting requirements. The same, I'm sure you repeat that here every year, reduce the debt bias in corporate taxation because that would increase cross-border equity holding.
Thank you very much, Laurence. And to close that chapter, José Viñals at the bank with a global footprint in more than 60 markets across the globe. How do you see the risk and opportunities in Europe compared to the rest of the world? How would you qualify the situation here?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the invitation to being here today. Europe has both conjunctural, structural, and architectural issues, and some of them have been outlined already. We bank in many emerging markets in the world, and of course, a big difference between Europe and those emerging markets is that Europe is a very mature economy with very strong institutions. Still to be perfected in terms of the European architecture, but it's unfortunately a low growth region. And that's something that should change. While emerging markets, they have much less developed institutions, but they are high growth potential. So I think that this is an important difference between the two. If we look at Europe, there has been already a lot of references to the need to complete the European architecture in terms of, maintaining the maintaining the monetary union, but combining it with a more perfected banking union, with the common deposit insurance scheme, with a sort of backstop fund. But I think there are more things, capital markets union and some elements of fiscal union, which have not been mentioned yet, and which I think are very important for Europe to function better. And those have also an important bearing on the current economic situation. Because if we had elements of fiscal integration, I think that monetary policy would be relieved from some of the burden that it has nowadays, and then we would go to a more balanced policy mix. And one other point on Capital Markets Union. Capital Markets Union is there in order to provide market participants with ability to have more market-based financing. For what? For investing. But you invest when you have an attractive rate of return. And this attractive rate of return is linked to the potential growth rate of these economies. And for that, I think an important complement to Capital Market Union is to put in place the labor and product market reforms that would make projects more investable in Europe, more attractive, and therefore the incentives to go to equity or debt financing through markets would be higher. So I think that there is an important synergy between structural reforms, like the ones that organizations like the OECD and the IMF proclaim all the time, and some of the architectural issues in the European Union. Just one final word. Our business is to connect people across borders. And what we find in Europe is, even if it's a lower growth area in terms of economics, but it has a lot of financial capacity, great corporates, great financial institutions, and there is a lot of capital needed in emerging markets. So our business is to intermediate through trade and finance flows all of this business, and therefore take advantage of the strong financial capacity of the European Union and the business opportunities of high growth regions like emerging markets, and make the best of both worlds.
So you outline low growth situation in Europe, reminding us of the main target, investing, but does low growth mean also lower risk? So it's a big attraction for investors as well? Is it a big competitive advantage for the European area?
Well, I think that if you look at emerging markets in Europe as a package, you have an area which is more mature, and therefore it is lower returns in terms of potential growth. As you said, lower risks, particularly risks that come from the institutional side, while in the emerging markets you have higher return, but also you have higher risk. So the important thing is how you manage this portfolio, and we try to be on with one foot in one place and another, and intermediate so as to achieve the best sort of combination of alternatives.
The best of both worlds. Thank you very much. So now that we have completed this brief overview about Europe, I suggest we move on to the core debate of this panel, which is the concrete action, the practical measure the finance industry could undertake to support the real economic growth. And to that respect, financial centers play a key role. So I propose, Hiroshi Nadako, that you walk us through the FinCito Tokyo objective and how could this newly formed organization could support the real economic growth in Japan?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me first go through what we came through in the past 2 decades. Japan experienced two financial crises in the past 2 decades. One is the homegrown financial crisis of the 1990s, and the second one is the global financial crisis. Japanese financial sector was severely damaged by the homegrown financial crisis, but survived the global financial crisis relatively unscathed because they didn't really invest in synthetic instruments like CDOs. But the Japanese financial institutions kept a kind of low profile because of lack of investment opportunities over the protracted period of deflation. And meanwhile, Japan's economy faced structural problems stemming from demographic challenges. So these were, the challenges we were facing. But things are now changing, I think, really, supported by the right set of economic policies under so-called Abenomics. Japan is emerging out of deflation. Despite various uncertainties, including geopolitical tensions, the corporate sector profitability is improving, and this is translated into robust capital expenditure, particularly in the labor-intensive industries against a backdrop of acute labor shortage that is we are facing. So this improvement in the macroeconomic environment provides global investors with favorable business and investment opportunities, I think, for the very first time in many, many years. Now, the challenges to getting the Japanese economy back on track to sustain growth is quite clear. One, Japan has to elevate labor productivity in order to more than offset the headwind that comes from demography, declining population. That's number one. And number two, Japan has to provide household sector with better investment opportunities. The households has accumulated financial assets amounting to 1,800 trillion yen, which is 15 trillion euros. And they remain heavily underutilized. So the money must be invested in a better way so that people can celebrate longevity, so to speak. In meeting these two challenges that I mentioned, we need better financial skills. And that is why we would like to invite more global financial institutions, including asset managers, to come to Japan to inspire and stimulate the domestic players. In this regard, the memorandum of understanding that was concluded with Paris Europlage will prove extremely useful, I think. The MOU aims at strengthening relationship and compatibility between the Paris and the Tokyo financial hubs. They focus on emerging market managers program, fintech, and sustained growth. So these are the three areas that we would like to concentrate. Now, fortunately, Japan's Financial Services Agency, which is a regulatory body, is cooperating with the Tokyo Metropolitan Government and fully support the FinCity Tokyo initiative. And this has implemented measures that ensure smooth access for the newcomers to Japanese market. And this support initiative is echoed by the Bank of Japan, which was my former body, which has constantly upgraded payment settlement system, which is the key infrastructure, the financial sector. Thus, I think this FinCity Tokyo is an initiative supported by across the board public-private sectors. I think that FinCity Tokyo can perform a catalytic role, an intermediate role in interconnecting the Tokyo with other financial centers. And in doing so, I hope that the network I have built up over the years in the international community can prove useful in reinforcing the relationship between Tokyo and other major financial centers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So first issue we covered here is financial centers and how could they attract more investors. Another issue we're going to cover now is long-term investments and local economy, local business support. So I think, Eric Lombard, it's fair to give you the mic now because Caisse des Dépôts and Consignation carries out very specific mission to support the economy to that respect. Can you give us an overview of the positive action you have towards infrastructure, long-term investment and local businesses?
Sure. Good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting conference. We live in a world where, and economists I'm sure will support that, we need long-term investment. We need long-term investment for many purposes. Probably the most important of them is to cope with climate change. And we are also in a world where regulation is going against long-term investment. And I've been for a long time in the insurance industry and before in the banking industry. So I've seen that very clearly, unfortunately. In this world, an institution like Caisse des Dépôts has the role of transforming the short-term deposits of the French savers into long-term and very long-term investments. The longest term we do in terms of lending, we've put together a few months ago a new loan of a duration of 80 years, 80 for land acquisition. We go up to 60 years, 60 for water supply. So we are really very long-term, again, based on short-term deposits. The total footing of Caisse des Dépôts is north of 400 billion euro. The bulk of our action is long-term lending. I mentioned that, especially for social housing and equity investments with a focus on infrastructure And of course, I cannot here but mention the project that we are working together with Augustin de Romanet, which is called CDG Express, which is part, by the way, of Europlace projects to make our airport closer to the financial center of Paris. That is an important project that I'm sure will come up very soon. Everything related to high-speed broadband, because in the country development, of course, this is absolutely key, and all type of infrastructure and development of the type. The idea is to be a catalyst of development. Typically, when we invest €1 of equity, there are €7 of equity coming from the private sector.
Systematically, that's
the average. That's what we try to do. When there is a project which is easy to finance by the private sector, actually, the economy does not need us, and then we leave it to the private sector totally. But when it is a bit more difficult, a bit more risky, a bit more long-term, then we are in, and we help the project to exist.
So that's what you said about infrastructure. Do you have specific action for local businesses apart from the infrastructure dimension?
Local businesses can be supported in two ways. First, we are typically the financier of the local authorities to make sure that the environment is positive for the economy. And we are also a 50% shareholder of BPI France, which is a bank that has been put up 7 years ago in order to support small businesses alongside with large banks like the one headed by Laurent Mignon. And that has proved very effective, because one of the weaknesses of the French economy, especially if you compare to the German economy, is our Mittelstand is much weaker and so need to be supported partly by houses like BPI France and Caisse des Dépôts.
And can you give us a figure of the money invested by BPI France last year? Do you have that in mind?
Well, the total footing of BPI France is 75 billion euros. So in terms of investment, BPI France together with Caisse des Dépôts, we invest in capital 1.5 billion a year. And in lending, our objective is to be beyond 20 billion a year, which unfortunately we have not reached last year, but we are still working on it.
You're on course for that year. Thank you very much. So if we stay a little bit more on local businesses and economy, Laurent Mignon, of course, everybody knows Banque Populaire and Caisse d'Épargne network are very rooted in the territories and in the local economy too. Give us a few examples, just like Eric did, on what you actually do for them.
Well, I think it's, as Eric mentioned, it's very important that we have a strong SME sector, because compared to Germany, we lack effectively the strengths of this Mittelstand that make the strength of the German economy for years. Well, we are, as Caisse d'Épargne, I must say, one of the partners of local authorities together on the side of Caisse des Dépôts for historic reason, but we are moving also from Caisse d'Épargne network, for example, on the SMEs sector, which is not the number one sector of the Caisse d'Épargne, but moving forward, we have 28,000 customers in that field together, and we grow it fast because 2,600 of them join the Caisse d'Épargne client base last year with a 24% increase of the lending we're doing to 6 billion to them. So it's a very concrete development. Banque Populaire is the number one bank of SME in France, with a 42% penetration rate for companies with between 25 and 250 employees, which is really the bulk of the company you want to help in order to foster growth. So this is a very important sector for us, very important and very dynamic, and we're the number second bank also for the professionals, so the small local independent actors. So that's the very, very important, and we have significant growth in that area. We use obviously the network, 7,600 agency locally routes everywhere in the territory, but we also use elements of the in order to help those less easy to finance companies to move. I can take two examples. We partner with a loan agreement with the European Investment Fund as part of the European InnovFin program, which is a 200 million agreement where we can finance new companies, and we already have made 50 of them last year, and we moved to 100 more coming, and that's helping the thing to move. Oh, this means we're out of time, so.
I don't know if you recognize this song, but it's the climate alarm. And I'm here to tell you that you're being complicit of climate crimes. It's good that you're laughing because millions of people are crying around the world. Just because you keep investing in fossil fuel industry. We need to keep fossil fuel in the ground, not just coal, but also oil and gas.
We're going to move on the green finance subject in a few minutes.
In the fossil fuel industry and the worst projects in the world, you're being climate criminals. Not doing enough, not just doing enough, but doing worse. You keep investing in the worst project in the world. The CDC, the BPI, the European Investment Bank, Africa, you're all investing.
Okay, this is a little reminder that we're going to cover the green finance subject in a few minutes when we're done with the local businesses. Laurent Mignon, have you lost the thread of your speech, or are you back on track?
No, it's fine. And I wanted just to mention that we also at Banque Populaire are working with the Jungen Plan in order to help to give guarantee to small, very small entrepreneurs that want to start new business. And that's a very important element. And that could be also a business in the green economy.
Yeah,
So,
we're going to move on to the green economy as soon as possible. I just have one question, and anybody around the table can take it. You've both mentioned this Mittelstand sort of fantasy, but that we've been talking about for years or decades. What can we actually do now to really make sure our SME can grow into mid-cap as soon as possible?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think there's a series of laws that have been passed over the last few years that give hope to that, and we see growth in the SMEs in France with a good dynamism. I think everything which has been done about the labor market is, I think, an element that will help that. I think the next step is really how can we reinforce the capital structure of those companies, which probably is the next step that we have to
take in order to make it happen. Yeah. Eric Lombard, do you agree on that?
Excuse me, I missed the last point. I missed that because I was thinking about, I disagree with the method used by this woman, but I agree with the urgencies that she mentioned. And
so you prefer we move on to the green finance subject and sustainability, rather than the Mittelstand. Let's do that.
Well, I believe we have been asked to do that, and I think it. I mean, she has a point. But by the way, many of us mentioned that in the opening remarks, because obviously we are already working on it. And the point of fighting global warming is, in my view, not a question of financing, because we have the financing which is available. We have the ability to finance whatever project that is put forward in order to deal with that. What we lack is projects. Because, for instance, Caisse de Dépôt has been investing a lot in new energies. Windmills, solar energies, and even some power plants based on biomass, based on vegetable things. So the technology exists. The point is we need more projects to do that, and that is really a call to all the municipalities and also the energy providers. And there is a second element I want to mention, which is absolutely critical. About 40% of the green gas emission is coming from housing and buildings. And there is a very important work ahead of us, which is to modify all the housing projects, all the buildings we have, in order to make them much more fuel efficient, which is good for the planet, which is also good for the revenues of people living in these buildings. And we have not put the right level of priority on those issues. And so, again, I disagree with the method, but there is an urgency and we have to deal with it.
I would like you, José Viñals, to react on what Eric has just been said on we lack project. Do you share his view? Energy transition project, do you find them easy to finance? Do you have a lot of them on your plate today or not?
Well, we have quite a few. We made the strategic decision last year to stop the financing of any new coal anywhere in the world, and in the emerging markets in which we bank, energy is a very important constraint for economic growth. So we decided to stop that and to improve significantly the amount of money that we devote to the financing of clean technologies. I think that there is a big business opportunity for financing the transition of the world to a low carbon economy. There is a big opportunity there, so I think it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. The thing is, how do you put together the projects so that they provide the adequate returns? And I think that this is something which is doable, and certainly the private sector has the capacity to do so. Just to signal some of the things we have been doing lately, we have helped support the issuance of the first blue bond in the world, which is oriented towards preserving the maritime biosphere. We have started providing green deposits. We started with Unilever, a corporate deposit, where the money provided in the deposit is earmarked to support the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. We are now providing green loans, where the interest rate you pay is related to the amount of emissions that you make or you don't. So the interest rates go up and down. So I think there are lots of initiatives going on. And I think sustainability is something which has become a very important motivation for the provision of finance. So as I said at the beginning, it is the right thing to do because the planet is at risk, but I think it's also the smart thing to do. And I think that we in the private sector, banks and other private sector participants in the financial services industry, we can help a lot in financing those projects and making the world a better place.
Thank you. Laurence Boone, maybe you can give us, from your perspective, a key takeaway on that green finance sustainability subject.
Thanks. So I will try to do it in a more quiet way, but I think on the magnitude, she's probably right. Let me start first by rebounding on what Eric was saying about investment and the difficulty to find investment. Well, actually, we at the OECD worked for the German G20 and estimated that you need about 6.3 trillion investment per year if you want to transition energy. So there should be a host of investment. And it's basically doing what José was alluding to, moving away from coal into renewable energy or clean energy, non-fossil fuel one. So that, I think, needs first the identification, but very frankly, all the firms that use this fossil fuels energy should be very worried that it's going to become very expensive at some stage when there's a carbon price, and that there will be a shortage of energy when we decide to cap the volume of fossil fuel energy. The second thing is, if you talk about investment and you mentioned green assets, then, let's look at the number. We took 6.3 trillion on the one hand, and we took 180 billion of issuance of green assets on the other hand. There's a huge imbalance problem here. One of the reasons is one you mentioned, there's no unique labeling of what's a green bond. José can call a green bond something, but Eric can call it another way, and Laurent a different way. The Euro place, and perhaps the IF should actually put in place something very transparent and unified to define what it's calling a green bond. Governments have to play a huge role there. There's only a handful of states issuing green sovereign debt. There's France, there's Belgium, Indonesia, Ireland, and to some extent China. But once again, what are we talking about? So states have a role to play as well. Everybody has in mind the number of the French debt. Well, the issuance of green debt is less than 10 billion a year. There's also something that, we've been bashing ourselves because we are French when we compare ourselves with the German on SMEs, but we're actually leading in terms of transition energy with the Article 173 on reporting disclosure. That's something that other countries could take inspiration from. The one last thing I would like to say is actually policymakers have a huge role to do, and banks should be very worried of that because there is increasing talk of green stress tests. And that could actually expose a lot of how balance sheets, what are they made of. Green test is basically saying you have a huge shock to growth because suddenly you transition very quickly. So there's a shortage of energy. It costs more. And the value of assets which are dependent on fossil fuel, both energy firms but also firms using a lot of fossil fuels, falls dramatically. There was some estimate done by the CISL which says that if we were to price accordingly assets in line with the 2-degree energy goal, then it would mean a 15 to 20% drop on the stock market of these values. So that's a lot of numbers which I think are quite disproportionate compared to what's actually being done.
Thank you very much. Laurent Hiroshi, would you like to join the conversation on sustainability in green finance, maybe labeling green bonds more properly?
Okay. Yeah. Well, before talking about the green bond market, because I do agree green bond market is a very fast-growing market, an important one, but probably the size of the green bond market compared to the size of the issue is small. First of all, I want to remind that the understanding of the issue, how deep is the issue of climate transition, I think has been well taken into account now by most of the sectors, but specifically the French banking sector has taken a leading position, I think, for years. Well, in fact, since the COP21 in Paris. And basically all French banks have taken serious position in terms of their transitioning policy and specifically exiting the worst source of energy like coal. All of them has decided to exit financing new coal project, and most of them now are exiting clients that have between 50% or 25% of coal energy dependency. So this is really something that is moving on. Probably not enough, but moving on. And we've taken a week ago, like Augustin just mentioned it, with the French finance minister, Mr. Bruno Le Maire, a commitment to have a clear exit policy of the coal industry before the mid-2020 for each of the French banks. So there's clear commitment about a green finance and helping first financing new sectors, which is, and the green bond market is part of that, and two is about exiting the carbon, heavy carbon industry, which we are trying to do. We still have to remind that it is a transition, and then you cannot just go from one to the other without a period, just because the customer and the people can't afford that either, and I think it's still a significant point. Doesn't mean that it is not an urgency. On the green market, and I will leave the floor to you, really we need to have a more unified label, and we need to make sure that the taxonomy is the right one. The European Commission is moving the right direction, trying to create a common taxonomy, which I think is a key element in order to make sure that we have a market, and that we're not doing greenwashing, which is really what people don't want. People really want to have real green project. And this is moving forward. And I think by having a real taxonomy and probably an agency that can give you a right label, I think that will help this market grow further. And there's huge demand, specifically in Japan, by the way. When we went to Japan to see investors, huge demand about green and social bond, by the way, which is, this market is enlarging to also a social bond market.
Just a quick follow-up, if I may. I think there is a growing trend towards the so-called ESG. And I think this is more the case with the investment society. I think more needs to be done by the banking sector. Japan is a bank-centric economy, and I think there's a big room to be performed by the banking sector in this regard. So there are challenges. And talking about climate, I think this is also becoming a growing focus, because in my boyhood there were little air conditioners in school. Today the summer often becomes hot, and there is heavy rain, and we are clearly see changes in the climate, and this must be addressed in a proper manner, and perhaps in a collective way. And I think also in this area banks have a lot of role to be performed.
Thank you very much. So we're going to close that chapter, and I would like to set aside a few seconds for each of you to react to my last question. But Jose, maybe now, once we've completed this overview on the subject of real economy, do you think this concept of real economy is still relevant in today's world? I know you would like maybe to challenge the concept with the audience today.
I think that the concept of the real economy means different things to different people. I think it's something that grew up from our understanding of what happened in the financial crisis, where the financial sector in many countries seemed to be moving away from serving the needs of what we call the real economy. So beyond semantics, I think there were in many countries, and the United States was at the origin of the great financial crisis, where there was a financial sector which was out of sync with the economy. And I think that the financial sector, the key role is to finance sustainable growth. You know, what we were hearing before about, financing SMEs, helping clients better administer their wealth, plan for their retirement, helping projects to be financed, which are, profitable and sustainable, helping through advanced products and derivatives, firms to better fulfill their corporate objectives. I think that this is something that the financial sector is uniquely positioned to do, very much in sync with the real economy. I think that a lot has happened since the crisis. One of the things we need to recognize as bankers is that as a result of the behavior of a number of banks in certain countries, the whole banking industry has lost some of the trust that society had on us. And we need to regain the trust. We need to regain the trust by showing society that we are helping them, that we're helping people lead better lives, households, firms, big, small, medium. And that's something which is very much at our hand. And I think that the discussion that we had nowadays, in this panel and many other places, shows that the financial services industry and banking sector in particular has moved on. Regulation has played its part in helping us move towards a safer, more sustainable banking system from the financial integrity point of view. But I think that there have been very important reforms internal to the banks in terms of governance and so on, which have aligned much better to the ultimate purpose of helping finance sustain and sustainable economic growth, which makes life better for citizens.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give you, I consider that maybe a challenge that you put forward for that as a closing remark. I will give you each 20 seconds to outline what is, in your view, the key challenges ahead for the finance industry. Hiroshi, let's start with you. 20, 30 seconds, and then we'll be on time.
All right. There are a lot of uncertainties like trade war and geopolitical tensions, but I would like to focus as a former central banker on monetary policy. I think renewed momentum towards monetary accommodation poses a challenge over the longer run. The recent moves by major central banks show that there's going to be a renewed monetary accommodation that implies that corporate firms can borrow at cheap funding costs, continue to borrow at cheap funding costs, and that would add to the leverage that is already very high. I think this is the case with the US leverage loans, or hence the CLOs. And you can also see the emerging market economies that build up of non-corporate factor, non-financial sector holding a lot of debt, which has accumulated to unprecedented levels. Now, all of these are probably very good to support the global economy for now. But it pushes the risk into the future. And therefore, for me, seems to me that the big challenge going forward is how to, in the future, unwind this leverage in an orderly manner without triggering a disruption in the financial market.
Thank you.
Well, to be very, very short, there's one element in order to foster the real economy is how close you are to client, what trust you create to them. So really our aim is making sure that we're close to our client, understanding their needs. Transition is one of them, and creating that trust on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I believe we still have an issue with regulation, if I understand the strengthening of regulation following the great financial crisis. But there is a contradiction between the monetary policy, easing investments in order to foster investments, and the supervision, which obliges banks and insurance companies to hold a high level of equity. And I'm worried to see Basel IV coming, which will have a negative impact of long-term investment. And I believe we should ease Solvency II, because you need insurance companies to hold long-term assets. Caisse de dépôt is holding 55 billion of equities. I think it's a useful role. And the fact that we have to put too much equity behind those investments in the long term is not positive for the economy and for the fight against climate change.
Thanks. I will be quick and rebound on some of the things that were already said. I would just like to give one number, like the amount of debt which is being issued since the financial crisis has doubled in real term, and it's now 13 trillion. Out of that, more than 50% is BBB. BBB is just above, it's just the last notch on investment grade. If growth was to slow down, perhaps because of tension, then we run the risk of seeing a cascade of downgrading of that debt, and that what worries us very much at the moment. Which is why I can agree with you on Solvency II, but I also think that on the asset management side, which has been much less regulated, then there's a huge liquidity issue if the scenario we've just discussed was to materialize. So to me, one of the things that people should keep in mind is the regulator will address asset management liquidity issue soon, and they should be prepared or better prepare for that.
Very briefly, I worry about globalization and what's going on in the world. So I agree with everything which has been said. But for a global bank and for many global companies, international banks, I think that we need to make sure that globalization is perfected and not destroyed. I think it would be very difficult to live in a world where we have a serious fragmentation of globalization, or where the world is divided in areas of influence from the economic point of view, which are wide apart from each other, where globalization is, not only segmented but bifurcated. So I think that's something which could be very damaging. I think it could be avoided. So to me, this is one of the key challenges that the world economy faces. And I think that globalization should be perfected, but it should not be destroyed. And now we are, at a time where things are happening, which may set the clock back decades. And I think we should avoid that. Multilateralism, globalization, imperfect, yes, they have served the world well, they need to be improved, but please let's not break them down, because then this is something that could kill not only the economic growth that we have, but it could also lead us into a much worse world.
Thank you very much. You can give a big round of applause to the panelists. Thank you very much.